Welcome to Inside Criminology. I'm your host, and in this deep dive, we explore Chapter 3 of Larry J. Siegel's Criminology, turning our attention to those often overlooked in the study of crime, the victims.
That's right. It's a crucial perspective.
From the emotional and financial costs of victimization to the theories that explain why some are more vulnerable than others, we unpack how criminology helps us understand and support victims of crime.
And there's a lot to unpack there.
Okay, let's dive into this deep dive into the world of victimization, drawing directly from the source material you've provided. Our mission is to extract the most important nuggets and help you see what's most significant here.
And the significance is, unfortunately, immense. Right from the start, the source highlights the sheer scale.
How big are we talking?
Well, the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey, estimates something like 24 million victimizations every year in the U.S.
24 million, that's staggering.
It really is. And the material makes it clear this isn't just a number. Being a victim, it has these considerable long-term consequences, really ripples through a person's life.
Those consequences hit hard, financially too, right? The economic costs sound huge.
Oh, they're vast. The total loss, estimated around $450 billion annually.
Billion with a P.
Yep, $450 billion. That breaks down to roughly $1,800 for every single person in the U.S. when you factor in justice system costs, social costs.
Like the costs associated with addiction the source mentions?
Exactly. And that's just the societal picture. The individual impact can be devastating and really long-lasting.
So not just the immediate loss, like a stolen wallet.
No, far beyond that. Victims can face long-term drops in their earnings, struggle with career goals because of what happened.
The source gives some specific figures.
It does. An assault might cost someone around $1,400 over time. A murder.
Oh.
Tragically, the estimate is around $3 million.
$3 million.
And what really jumps out is the impact on young people. Adolescent victims of violence. They can earn significantly less over their lifetime.
How much less?
Potentially $82,000 less in the U.S., maybe up to $237,000 less in Canada. It's because the psychological, the physical trauma, it just really hinders their path through school and into a career.
And it's not just the crime itself causing damage. The material brings up something called system abuse.
Yes, this is so critical. It's where the experience with the justice system actually adds another layer of victimization.
How does that happen?
Imagine going through something awful and then facing maybe callous police questioning, struggling just to get basic info about your own case.
Or having your stuff held as evidence forever.
And the source shares some really disturbing accounts. Some rape victims felt their treatment by legal or medical services was so damaging they felt, quote, re-raped.
That's horrific.
It is. And then there's the practical stuff, like losing wages to go to court or authorities maybe not taking your fear of retaliation seriously. It's rough.
And the trauma itself, it doesn't just vanish.
Absolutely not. The source really emphasizes the long-term stress, the anxiety. It sticks around.
For how long?
Years, potentially. Adolescents, again, seem particularly vulnerable. We see higher rates of hostility, lasting PTSD.
PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress.
Exactly. And the research is pretty clear. Girls abused as children, they face higher risks later, lower self-esteem, suicidal thoughts, and tragically, a much higher likelihood of being abused again as adults.
It's that cycle of violence idea.
It's a terrible reality.
Yeah.
And kids victimized at home, they're more likely to run away, which paradoxically puts them at more risk on the streets, maybe getting involved with the juvenile justice system.
So that link between being victimized and later problems, that seems like a recurring theme.
It really is. Traumatic sexual experiences linked to psychological issues like eating disorders, mental illness, but also social problems, homelessness, repeat victimization.
The study on homeless women.
Yeah, that found incredibly high rates of past abuse, both as kids and adults, alongside mental health struggles. And for spousal abuse victims, high rates of depression, PTSD, anxiety, OCD.
And it's not just physical abuse, right?
Crucially, no. The material points out psychological abuse can be just as damaging. Plus, you have potential physical disabilities from violence and the financial nightmare if you don't have insurance.
Let's zero in on those adolescent victims with that criminological enterprise section from the source. The numbers seem particularly stark.
They are. That research by Kilpatrick, Saunders, and Smith surveyed over 4,000 adolescents aged 12 to 17.
And the findings.
Revealed a kind of Hidden crisis, massive numbers, estimated 1.8 million sexually assaulted, nearly 4 million severely physically assaulted, over 2 million subjected to physically abusive punishment.
Just awful numbers. Was there anything more common than those?
Yes, by far the most common was witnessing violence. That impacted an estimated 8.8 million young people, almost 9 million kids seeing something deeply traumatic.
Were there patterns in who was affected most among these kids?
Yeah, very clear patterns. Higher rates among Black and Native American youth.
Specifically?
Native Americans showed the highest rates for sexual assault. For physical assault, it was Native Americans, Blacks, and Latinos who had the highest rates.
What about gender differences? Did that play a role?
A significant role. Girls faced a much higher risk for sexual assault, about 13%, versus just over 3% for boys.
But boys were higher for physical assault.
That's right, over 21% for boys compared to about 13% for girls. Witnessing violence, though, and abusive punishment, those were more evenly split, roughly.
So beyond the immediate horror, what were the long-term outcomes linked to this?
The link is strong, especially to mental health issues and delinquency. Victims of sexual assault, 3 to 5 times higher rates of negative outcomes.
Including PTSD.
Definitely. Lifetime PTSD prevalence for this age group was over 8%. That's huge. And girls were significantly more likely than boys to experience it.
Does sexual assault increase PTSD risk for boys too?
Dramatically. For both boys and girls, experiencing sexual assault significantly raised their PTSD rate compared to non-victims. Same goes for physical assault and abusive punishment, strongly linked to PTSD.
And the connection to substance abuse or crime?
Also very clear. About a quarter of those physically assaulted or abused reported lifetime substance abuse or dependence, compared to only 6% of non-victims.
And delinquency.
Even more stark. Physically assaulted boys, almost 5 times more likely to commit a serious index offense. Physically assaulted girls, nearly 10 times more likely to engage in serious delinquent acts.
Wow.
Yeah. The research basically screams that protecting adolescents from violence is a national priority because these consequences are just so profound.
Beyond the direct impact, there's also the issue of fear. The source talks about how widespread that is.
Fear is a huge consequence, and it spreads beyond just the victim. It's pervasive, especially hitting vulnerable groups harder, the elderly, the poor, minorities.
And for victims, it doesn't just go away.
No, it can linger long after they've physically recovered. And interestingly, even just hearing about others being victimized can make people more fearful, more cautious.
Like that Chicago housing project example.
Exactly, where fear of retaliation just paralyzed efforts to deal with gang crime.
And the fear isn't always specific to the crime they experienced, like a spillover.
Correct. Someone assaulted might then live in constant fear of burglary. It's described as a fundamental shift, seeing the world as less safe, less controllable. They're much more likely to suffer prolonged psychological stress.
Susan Brisson's story.
Yeah, from Aftermath. A powerful example of how trauma shattered her memory, her sense of the future, though she did find confronting it therapeutic.
This connection between being a victim and potentially becoming an offender, that antisocial behavior section, that's a heavy point.
It is, and it's crucial for understanding the whole picture. There's growing evidence that victims, especially kids who suffered abuse, they're statistically more likely to commit crimes themselves later on.
So abuse or neglect increases the odds of arrest.
Dramatically, both as a juvenile and as an adult.
And the trauma itself might contribute to later crimes.
That's the core of the cycle of violence idea. Young males physically or sexually abused, more likely to use substances. And incarcerated offenders. They report really high rates of PTSD from their own past victimization.
Which might help explain their behavior.
The source suggests it could be a factor. Boys and girls are more likely to be violent if they were targets of abuse, saw violence between adults, or were exposed to weapons. It's that difficult truth trauma can breed more trauma, more crime.
Okay, we've seen the problems victims face. Let's shift to the nature of victimization itself. What do the patterns, the NCVS data, tell us?
Well, the NCBS tracked around 24 million criminal events back in 2003. But importantly, it also showed crime and victimization rates were generally declining over the decade before that.
A significant decline.
Quite significant, yeah. Between 93 and 2003, violent crime victimization dropped 55% for those 12 and older. Property crime fell 50% per household. The source has figures showing these trends clearly.
So if rates were falling, does that mean victimization is just random bad luck?
The source argues strongly against that. It says victimization is not random. The patterns are stable, repetitive.
Meaning it's predictable.
It suggests victimization is a function of personal and ecological factors we can actually study and potentially influence, not just chance.
Okay, let's break down those factors. Starting with the social ecology, where does crime tend to happen?
Violent crimes. Slightly more likely in public areas, streets, parks, maybe schools, commercial spots like bars.
What about time of day?
More serious stuff, like rape or aggravated assault, leans towards nighttime, after 6 p.m. Two-thirds of rapes happen at night. Less serious violence, like unarmed robbery, more common during the day. And schools are significant locations. About a third of students get into a physical fight each year.
And the neighborhood matters a lot.
Definitely. Central city residents, much higher rates of theft and violence than suburbanites. Rural rates are almost half of city rates. Murder risk is highest in those disorganized inner city areas with gangs, drug trafficking.
What about the victim's home? Any patterns there?
NCVS findings point to larger homes, African-American homes, homes in the West, and urban homes being more vulnerable.
And less vulnerable.
Rural white homes in the Northeast seem least vulnerable. Also, homeowners tend to be less vulnerable than renters.
Why the decline then? Any theories?
The source speculates maybe population shifts away from cities, smaller families, more single-person homes. Fewer people in high-risk areas or smaller, lower-risk households overall might play a part.
Beyond location, what about individual victim characteristics?
Several key factors stand out: gender, age, social status, race.
Okay, let's take gender first.
Males are more likely victims of violent crime, overall robbery, assault. But women are disproportionately victims of rape and sexual assault.
So men more likely victimized overall, but the type differs.
Right. Though the source notes the gender gap seems to be narrowing. A key difference is who does it. Women are far more often victimized by someone they know about two-thirds of the time.
And men.
More often by a stranger, about half the time by someone known, half by a stranger.
Age seems like a massive factor, maybe more than people think.
It's one of the most dramatic patterns. Young people. Much, much higher risk. And that risk drops off sharply after age 25.
What about the elderly? Aren't they seen as vulnerable?
They are, but for violent crime, the stats are low. They're about 15% of the population, but only 1% of violent victimizations. Compare that to teens, 12, 19, similar population share, but over 30% of victimizations.
So teens are at much higher risk.
Way higher. Teens 16, 19 suffer over 50 victimizations per 1,000 people. Those 65 plus puff, only 2 per 1,000.
But the elderly are targets for specific crimes.
Absolutely. Frauds, scams, purse snatching, check theft, crimes in nursing homes. They might have savings, live alone, feel lonely, making them targets for fraud. And recovering financially is harder for them. Plus, elder abuse reports have sadly increased a lot.
How does social status play into this?
Statistically, the poorest Americans are the most likely victims of both violent and property crime across the board.
But wealthier people aren't immune.
No, they're more often targets for personal theft, pickpocketing, purse snatching. Maybe their appearance or car attracts thieves.
And marital status?
Never married individuals, male and female, have higher rates than married people. Widows and widowers have the lowest risk.
Why is that?
It's likely tied to age and lifestyle. Young singles go out more, interact with maybe higher risk peers. Older widowers tend to stay home more, avoid public spaces, less exposure. And finally, race and ethnicity. The data shows Black individuals are more likely than whites to be victims of violent crime.
Is that gap changing?
It seems to be narrowing, as serious violent crime has declined for both groups.
What drives those differences?
The source links it to things like income inequality, being forced to live in deteriorated urban areas with more substance abuse, poverty, discrimination, violence, plus lifestyles common in those at-risk areas. But importantly, Black victimization rates have seen a steep decline overall.
This leads us to repeat victimization or chronic victimization. That really underlines the non-randomness.
It really does. If you've been victimized once, your chance of it happening again goes up significantly. Same for households.
And it happens quickly.
Often, yes. Most repeats occur relatively soon after the first crime. It suggests repeat victims might share certain characteristics that make them persistently vulnerable. Think of a shy kid constantly bullied.
Finkelhor and Siegel identified some specific characteristics.
They did.
Yeah.
3 main things. Target vulnerability, like physical weakness or distress, making someone an easy target.
Okay. Number 2?
Target gratifiability, having something the offender wants, like an expensive coat or a particular skill.
And 3rd?
Target antagonism characteristics that unintentionally provoke anger or destructive urges, like being gay or maybe just argumentative. And repeat victimization can also happen if the victim doesn't take action or if authorities don't respond effectively.
Let's revisit victims and their criminals.
Right.
We know women are more likely to know their attacker.
Right. About 2/3 of female victims know the offender friend, acquaintance, intimate partner. Males, more likely victimized by strangers.
Other patterns.
Most crimes involve a single offender, usually over 20. Crime tends to be intraracial, black on black, white on white, though white victims are targeted more often just due to population size. And substance abuse, involved in about 1/3 of violent crimes.
That Jackson Carr case mentioned, a terrible example of family violence.
It is. And it highlights that over half of non-fatal personal crimes are by people the victim knows. Women, especially over 6 in 10 rape victims, say the offender was an intimate relative, friend, or acquaintance. Even robbery women are less likely than men to be robbed by a stranger.
Okay, we have a picture of who, where, and by whom. Now the big question, why? Historically, criminology focused on the offender.
Exactly. The victim was often overlooked. But pioneers like Hans von Hentig, way back, started saying, hey, the victim might influence the act, maybe shape and mold the criminal.
Which opened the door to victim-focused theories. First up, victim precipitation theory.
Right. The basic idea is the victim might trigger the crime through their behavior. This can be active precipitation.
Like provoking a fight.
Yeah, using threats, fighting words, maybe attacking first. Menachem Amir's early work on rape victims contributing. Very controversial. But the source notes courts sometimes still consider victim actions. Marvin Wolfgang studied this with homicide too.
And passive precipitation. How's that different?
Less about direct provocation, more like having a characteristic that unknowingly threatens or encourages the attacker.
Like what?
Could be personal conflict, competition for a job, maybe. Or a woman targeted after a promotion makes her partner jealous. Or it could be belonging to a group whose presence threatens the attacker, like hate crimes against immigrants, seen as job competition. It's also linked to power dynamics, a strength. It might explain repeat victimization if the behavior persists.
Okay, moving on to lifestyle theory. What's the angle here?
This one argues your lifestyle, your daily routine, increases or decreases your exposure to offenders. Risk goes up if you say, hang out with young men, go out late, live in the city.
And down if you stay home, move rural, get married.
Generally, yes. The core idea, crime isn't random. It's partly a function of the victim's lifestyle choices and environment.
So certain activities are inherently riskier.
That's the argument. Heavy drinking, drug use, being involved in crime yourself, all increase your chances of being victimized. Young runaways exposed to street life face higher risks.
Teenage males were highlighted.
Extremely high risk, yeah. Partly due to their typical lifestyle, hanging out, school activities, maybe going to bars where fights happen, histories of delinquency, gangs, weapons, drug dealing, massively increase the chance of being shot or killed.
And this risk continues into young adulthood. College, for example.
It does. College students partying, using drugs, higher risk. The source uses that study, Rape on Campus, Lifestyle and Risk, as a key example.
Right, that study. Did you find campuses are higher risk?
The finding suggests a significant problem. They estimated a campus with 10K female students could see over 350 rapes a year. That rate, 1 in 36 experiencing completed or attempted rape per academic year.
Seems high compared to general population stats.
Especially since the academic year is shorter. Yeah, it's startling. And over 1/3 reported other sexual coercion.
And mostly unreported.
Shockingly few reported to police, less than 5%. Most told a friend, not family or officials.
Who were the perpetrators? Strangers.
Almost never. Around 90% knew their attacker boyfriend, ex, classmate, friend. Mostly happened in the evening, often in student housing or at parties.
Did fighting back help, according to this study?
It seemed to. Victims who fought back were less likely to have the attack completed. Physical force was the most common response in attempted rapes.
What factors increased a woman's risk on campus?
4 main things. 1, frequently drinking to get drunk. 2, being unmarried. 3, prior sexual assault history. And 4, living on campus for on-campus incidents.
And many didn't see it as a crime.
Right. Self-blame, not understanding the legal definition, not wanting to label someone they knew as a rapist. Complex reasons. It really reinforces lifestyle theory. Young women's routines and associations, especially with peers more likely to drink, put them at higher risk.
And this connects back to the blurred lines between victims and criminals.
Yes. The source revisits this, citing youth studies showing victimized kids were more likely to be involved in gangs, assaults, drug dealing, carrying weapons, which in turn increased their risk of being victimized again 2 to 4 times higher. Carrying a weapon was especially high risk.
So crime and victimization are often linked through high-risk lifestyles.
That's the argument. Lifestyle theory helps explain why certain groups statistically have higher rates. Their lifestyles involve more exposure.
Okay, next theory. Deviant place theory. How does this differ?
This one shifts the focus almost entirely to the environment. It argues victimization happens mainly because people live in or frequent socially disorganized, high-crime areas.
So it's the place, not necessarily the person's behavior.
Pretty much. More time in dangerous places equals more exposure, regardless of your personal choices. The neighborhood crime level is seen as more important than individual lifestyle within that neighborhood.
What defines a deviant place?
Poor, densely populated, transient areas, often mixed commercial and residential. Commercial properties are easy targets. As successful people leave, those left behind may be homeless, addicted, elderly, poor, become easier targets.
So trying to be safe in such an area is harder.
The theory suggests precautions have less effect because you're constantly surrounded by motivated offenders just by living there. Wilson's work on affluent flight, leaving minorities in high-crime areas, is mentioned. Its strength is explaining why even conventional people become victims if they live in these areas.
All right, finally, routine activities theory. Cohen and Felsen.
A very influential one. The core idea is that predatory crime depends on the interaction of 3 things reflecting our daily routines.
3 key ingredients.
Exactly. 1, the availability of suitable targets, homes with stuff to steal, vulnerable people.
Okay.
Yeah.
The absence of capable guardians, not just police, but homeowners, neighbors, anyone who could intervene or deter.
So unguarded targets. And 3.
The presence of motivated offenders, people ready and willing to commit crime, like unemployed teens.
When these 3 converge, crime is likely.
That's the theory. Targets are more likely hit if they're risky, poorly guarded, and exposed to offenders. Think young women drinking heavily at frat parties perceived as easy targets. Maybe attackers rationalize it due to intoxication.
And you can reduce risk by changing routines.
Right. Getting married, moving to a small town. Things that reduce exposure to that convergence.
This connects to hotspots.
It does. Motivated offenders cluster in certain areas, creating these hotspots. Living there increases risk. But even offenders need opportunity. An undefended, attractive target in a hotspot is hard to resist. Basically, high-risk area plus late nights plus valuables plus risky behavior plus being alone, high chance of victimization.
There's also moral guardianship.
Yeah, an added layer. Some argue even with opportunity, people refrain if they have strong social bonds, conventional values.
Yeah.
These bonds act as a kind of internal moral guardian.
Like peer disapproval.
Exactly. That date rape study found men were less likely if they thought their peers would disapprove. Peer rejection acts as moral guardianship.
So routine activities links closely to lifestyle and opportunity.
Deeply intertwined. Where you live affects guardianship. Your lifestyle affects exposure, target attractiveness, protection. It's all connected.
Is there evidence supporting this theory?
Quite a bit cited. Cohen and Felsen linked rising crime in the 60s, 80s to fewer guardians at home, more women working. Messner's study linked unemployment and decreased juvenile homicide, suggesting supervision matters. Suburbia growth reduced guardianship while increasing portable wealth.
And later declines.
Linked to community organizing, better policing, guardianship, stronger economy, fewer motivated offenders. If crime's rational, changing opportunity or risk changes behavior.
Felsen's crime in everyday life.
Argues strongly, more opportunity, more crime. He blames the shift from villages, known people, traceable goods, to anonymous cities, easy to hide, escape, dispose of loot.
The shopping mall example.
Perfect modern example. Strangers, places to hang out, crowds for cover, attractive goods, vulnerable cars in big lots.
So the crime boom wasn't just more bad people.
Felsen argues structural changes created massive opportunity. Suburbs scattered families, less guardianship. Dispersed homes were harder to protect. Fewer people per household. Commuting left cars vulnerable. Big stores invited shoplifting.
He even asked us to think about technology's impact now.
Right. Internet, phones, ATMs, how do they change routines and opportunities? His conclusion. Prevention should focus on reducing opportunity, not changing people.
So its strength is explaining rates, linking behavior to opportunity, suggesting practical prevention.
Exactly. Focuses research on opportunity, guardians, population shifts, crime rates.
Okay, we've seen the toll, the patterns, the theories. Given the scale, most people victimized at some point, many with long-term effects, how is society caring for the victim?
This is a vital shift. The source stresses helping victims isn't just charity, it's society's duty. There's growing recognition that victims have rights and needs balanced with defendant rights.
What kicked off the government response?
Reagan's 1982 task force was key. It pushed for balancing rights, recommended witness protection, restitution, fair treatment guidelines, better compensation programs.
Leading to legislation.
Yes, like the Omnibus Victim and Witness Protection Act, victim impact statements, better protection, restitution. Then the big one, VOCA, the Victims of Crime Act in '84.
VOCA established funding.
Crucially, yes. Federal funds for state victim compensation and assistance programs. It created the Office for Victims of Crime, OVC, to oversee this, funding rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, training, all paid for by fines on federal offenders. Millions getting paid out for medical care, counseling, support.
And victim service programs popped up everywhere.
Thousands of them now, at all levels, offering things like victim compensation states, paying victims for damages like medical bills, lost wages. Awards vary, but VOCA helps fund these.
Court services sound essential for navigating the system.
Totally. Helping victims understand procedures, testifying, bail, reducing fear and reluctance, providing transport, counselors, especially for vulnerable victims. The source even notes research suggesting supported victims find court less traumatic than thought.
Do they do public education too?
Over half do. Raising awareness of services, connecting agencies, even primary prevention like conflict resolution or school programs on dating abuse. And crisis intervention is key. Referrals for practical needs, shelter, food, medical. Many offer immediate support at the scene, hospital, home, vital when victims feel isolated.
What about victim offender reconciliation programs, VORPs? That sounds different.
Very different. Face-to-face meetings, mediated, aiming for restitution agreements, maybe reconciliation, handles serious cases now too. It's rooted in restorative justice, focusing on repairing harm, community involvement, not just punishment.
Victim impact statements give victims a voice in court.
A powerful voice. Most places allow victims to tell the judge their experience, the impact. Survivors describing the effect of a murder. There's debate on sentencing impact, but proponents say victims have a right to be heard, just like the prosecution represents public harm.
And victims' rights are now legally recognized.
Absolutely. Thanks to advocates like Frank Carrington, every state has some form of Victims' Bill of Rights. Many have constitutional amendments. Federal law also provides rights protection, notification, being heard, restitution, fairness.
Is this happening outside the U.S. too?
Yes. The source highlights the EU framework decision, binding minimum standards across the EU, respect, role in proceedings, information, support, protection, compensation, avoiding secondary victimization. A 2004 directive mandated national compensation schemes across the EU.
Victim advocacy groups help make these rights real.
Definitely. Diverse groups, independent, government-sponsored, they help victims navigate the system, lobby, police, request protection, help with statements, deal with media. Crucial support.
What about self-protection by individuals?
Driven by fear, people take action. Target, hardening better locks, alarms, bars, fences, cameras, dogs. More common where people feel unsafe. And evidence suggests things like alarms do reduce burglary.
Does fighting back work?
It's complex. The source says it can frustrate attackers but might increase victim injury risk. It can decrease completion odds but might escalate violence. Nuanced findings.
And firearms for self-defense.
The source presents Gary Kleck's research here. He estimates millions of defensive gun uses yearly. He argues armed victims kill more criminals than police and suffer fewer injuries with lower crime completion. It's presented as his research findings on a controversial topic.
Lastly, community organization.
Neighborhood-level efforts, patrols, block watches, working with police or independently. Activities range from patrolling to lobbying for lights to sharing crime info. Evidence on crime rate impact is limited, may be more effective as part of broader community groups.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the profound personal and societal costs victims bear to the complex theories that try to explain why some are targeted and others aren't.
And how society is trying to respond.
We've also seen how society, both in the U.S. and Europe, is evolving to better support and empower those affected by crime, whether through victim services, legal rights, or even individuals and communities taking steps to protect themselves. Here's where it gets really interesting. So what does this all mean for you? Perhaps the most provocative thought to leave you with is this. If victimization isn't random and is influenced by routine activities and lifestyle, to what extent do your daily choices impact your personal risk of becoming a victim? What stands out to you from this dive?